Mrs. Chamberlain.
Mrs. Augustus Chamberlain.
She seems to know as few people as I do.
Oh, I think she knows a good many of the women here.
They just don't want to know her.
The mysterious Mrs. Chamberlain, an immodestly rich widow ostracized by New York Stone, is one of the amazing characters of the Gilded Age series by HBO, which were inspired by real people and their real-life events that shaped America and its social and economic development at the turn of the century. And do you know who was the real Mrs. Chamberlain and why she was outcast of the New York elite society? This video will uncover her real-life secrets.
I've told you Mrs. Chamberlain is in a class by herself. She is far worse than Mrs. Russell in every way. To spend time in her company is to be contaminated.
This is my fourth video about the Gilded Age universe brought to us by Downton Abbey's author Julian Fellowes. In the first 3 episodes, we talk about the people who ruled the city's high society at the epoch, the old money and the nouveau riche. Take a look at my dedicated Gilded Age playlist to learn about the Russells, the Van Ryns, the Astors, and all the other major protagonists. And this time, I invite you to have a look at someone who was thrown out of society, albeit being technically an integral part of this community, the intriguing Mrs. Chamberlain.
Do any of you know Mrs. Chamberlain? That is, Mrs. Augustus Chamberlain?
Not really. I've met her a few times.
Aunt Agnes would never forgive me.
Surely there's more at stake here than Aunt Agnes's smelling salts.
I couldn't put it better myself.
Well, unlike with some other characters of the Gilded Age, it wasn't too difficult to find out who was the real-life inspiration for the outcast Sylvia Chamberlain, masterfully played by Jean Tripplehorn. It looks like Julian Fellowes got his inspiration from the life trajectory of the remarkable Arabella Huntington, an American philanthropist once known as the richest woman in the country. Her life trajectory was a complicated, yet at the same time a controversial one. Yet after learning it, you will get a perfect idea that she had every reason to be outcast by New York's polite society, well, at least according to their day's morale.
I see I must be blunt. Mrs. Chamberlain has things, terrible things in her past, which render her unsuitable as an acquaintance for any well-brought-up young lady.
First of all, it is really not clear when and where she was actually born. Various sources suggest the most plausible time frame between 1850 and 1851. As for the location, her own statement brings us to Mobile, Alabama, the birthplace of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, the prototype of Mrs. Russell and the heroine of one of my previous videos. However, some historians believe it to be inaccurate and say that she might have probably been born in Richmond, Virginia, to a rather modest family. You see, it is really hard to say how she made it up to New York, since not just a single event, yet her whole early life is shady to say the least. Her maiden name was Catherine Arabella Duval Yarrington, known as Belle, and it is believed that when she moved out of Virginia and came to New York in the late 1860s, she was already married to some Mr. Washam. Or she wasn't and was just his mistress. I told you, her background is not crystal clear.
What is she supposed to have done?
Well, before their marriage, Mr. and Mrs. Chamberlain knew each other.
Mr. Washam, a gambling parlor operator, was 20 years her senior and also married with children. According to New York Census records, the couple was registered as Mr. and Mrs., although there is no record of a marriage or previous divorce on Mr. Washam's part. He died soon after their supposed marriage and the birth of their first son, Archer, in about 1870. It appears like they married when she was already expecting a baby, scandalous thing by itself at the time. But there was an extra layer of scandal there. Rumor has it that the child was not Mr. Washam's son.
What precisely has she done wrong?
She lived in sin for years with old Chamberlain until his long-suffering wife finally died. Then he brought her to New York, and they pretended they'd only just met.
Some accounts suggest that Archer was in fact the biological son of Arabella's future husband, the very Collis Huntington with whom she somehow met in Richmond.
I thought she was married before.
She says that to explain the boy.
Her son.
The son of them both.
Anyways, the new widow and her son established themselves in New York with comfort and even buy some property there. Well, everyone was speculating it was Mr. Huntington who transferred some Manhattan residential properties into her name after the birth of their illegitimate son.
She only says her husband adopted him for the look of the thing. He is the spitting image of Chamberlain for a start.
Aunt Ada, is this true?
People think it's true.
What do people think is true?
Collis Potter Huntington was the railroad and shipbuilding tycoon who was the mastermind behind the creation of the Central Pacific and Southern Pacific Railroads, as well as the Newport News shipyards. He had a quite an impressive life trajectory too. Without going into further details, since this video is about his future wife Arabella, I'll just say that he became the first generational wealth, tycoon-type wealth, in his family of farmers. Another great example of an American dreamer who saw the opportunity and never lost his chance to make something out of it. Collis was 30 years older than her and already married with grown children. They began their relationship when Belle was in her teens and he was in his 40s, and she often traveled with him on business trips where Huntington introduced her as his niece.
I was with the husband of another woman while she was still alive. I broke the rules.
Interestingly, it was Belle and her mother who nursed the old, lawful Mrs. Huntington on her deathbed, and the latter apparently was happy about that. The whole story reminded me of the trilogy of Desire by Theodore Dreiser, the Stoic, where the already aged protagonist falls in love with this young girl and brings her to New York and builds this Fifth Avenue mansion as a gift for her.
I'm afraid women are an expensive hobby, sir. Especially pretty ones.
I'm afraid they are.
When old Mrs. Huntington died, Arabella became the new Mrs. Huntington. She was 34 and her now official husband was 63. Eventually, Collis adopted then 14-year-old Archer, and the family of 3 began their new lawful life in the city.
I thought he was adopted.
Well, so he is. In a way.
And it was all a long time ago now.
People have long memories in this town.
Alas, society wasn't so open-minded. They weren't eager to make Belle's life easy. Not only she led an immoral life, but her filthy rich husband was publicly disclosed as cynical promoter of his companies, eager to use money to bribe congressmen. I guess the level of their ostracism is perfectly conveyed in the Gilded Age series.
Marian, when and if you see Mrs. Chamberlain again, you are to turn your face away. Is that clear?
Very.
Yet the new Mrs. Huntington was a tough nut herself. She apparently had some talents and not only secured a personal fortune of $2 million before her liaison became officiated, but also managed to use Huntington's seed money and make fortune investing in real estate alongside Vanderbilt and Rockefeller. So you see, this girl from the South had some drive and personality that would help her move the mountains and achieve her very ambitious goals. I have even found the notion that her character became the foundation for the famous Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind.
I'll think of some way to get him back. After all, tomorrow is another day.
The series portrays her as a visionary art collector, an array of first-class artworks by her then controversial and now household name contemporaries is richly sprinkled by producers and decorators around her lavish mansion. That wasn't far from reality. Arabella constantly developed herself, became fluent in French and French culture, learned art history, and in the end developed a refined sense of taste. As a result, her first house was filled with art and furniture personally chosen by her. In time, she became one of the few women to become one of the major art collectors of the early 20th century. The decoration of her house was so successful that some of the rooms are still on display at the Museum of the City of New York. All that beauty and grandeur were then transferred to the couple's newly built mansion on the southeast corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street. If you are an art lover like me, you might have recognized some real masterpieces in the house of Mrs. Chamberlain. I was intrigued by whether Arabella Huntington did really possess them all. In my next video, I will identify all of those artworks and uncover their real-life provenance. Subscribe not to miss it coming.
But I'm admiring your pictures.
Come into the gallery. They're better there.
Let's get back to the not-so-trivial life path of Belle. Her husband, Collis Huntington, died in 1900, and she inherited a whopping sum of $50 million. Think of something closer to $500 million today. Arabella was deeply hurt by the loss of her almost lifelong companion, and donned her mourning dress of black and never wore anything but black in public. But don't get too sorry for her. In private, she led a rather joyful life, indulging herself with bright colors, exquisite fabrics, and shining jewels.
I don't regret my choice, not for a moment, because I knew a great love. But without it, my path would have been a stony one.
She also donated $100,000 to General Memorial Hospital in memory of her husband to establish the first cancer research fund in the country, the Huntington Fund for Cancer Research. Now the hospital is transformed into the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York.
She has been generous to charity in the past, I know, but
If she wants, she can be very generous indeed. Could you interest her in my cause?
She wasn't staying alone for long either, but brace yourself, she apparently had an eye for the Huntington men, or they had some unexplainable attraction to her. Anyways, soon after her husband died, she got close with his nephew, Henry Huntington. At least this time the lovers were of the same age. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing against the age difference or any other difference if two people love each other. I just tell you about the times when all those peculiarities were considered to be a fatal faux pas and unacceptable behavior for anyone with at least some dignity.
And I am fully aware of her reputation.
Yeah, but again, Henry was long married at the epoch, and hence another bombshell for the rumor-hungry New York Stone. In 1912, his wife died, and the two lovers, bearing the same surname, how convenient, right, tied the knot. For the next 12 years, they lived together in love and peace, working on their cultural and philanthropic projects. Arabella Huntington died in 1924 at the age of 74, by then one of the richest women in the world. Her son Archer inherited her mother's passion for studying and collecting art, which led to the creation of Archer Huntington's Hispanic Society of America Museum in New York. So I hope now you have a better picture of who was the inspiration behind the fictional Mrs. Chamberlain. Let's see what Season 2 of the Gilded Age series holds for her. And I hope to see you in my other videos. Bye!